So Israeli strikes on Lebanon are testing the fragile ceasefire deal between the United States and Iran. For more, we're joined today by Professor Robert Lawrence, Professor of English and Turkic Studies at Dongduk Women's University. Professor Lawrence, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So the U.S. and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. Why is Pakistan stepping in as a mediator, and what's behind both sides agreeing to a temporary pause?
Pakistan has a unique role to play here. Field Marshal Munir has a particularly good rapport with President Trump on a personal level. They also, they don't have U.S. air bases unlike a lot of other regional actors, and they have a brotherly relationship with Iran. Another thing is that they have a lot of skin in the game. They get almost all of their oil and gas from the Strait of Hormuz, so they need that to be open. And they also need de-escalation because there's potential for them to be brought into the conflict via Saudi Arabia. And if this were to happen, then their entire western border would be in a war zone, apparently, because they're at war with Afghanistan right now. So that's a very dangerous reality. So they have skin in the game. They need this to actually happen. As far as the motivation for why people came to the table, I think it's a bit unclear, but I think it's a combination of things. One, regionally, I think there was a lot of pressure to step back away, to de-escalate from this ending civilization type rhetoric. Nobody wanted that to happen, and nobody wanted to see the reaction that Iran would have if something like that were to happen. Globally, I think China played a big role in getting Iran to the table. And in the U.S. case, I think domestically, there's a lot of anxiety about some of the polling data in the upcoming election. There are a lot of Republicans that are worried that the midterms aren't going to go well. And I think, that you take that along with the financial pressure that's happening. And I think, everybody involved needed to kind of take some sort of controlled de-escalation.
I see. And after the ceasefire deal, Israel still continued to carry out an attack on Lebanon, and Iran is accusing the United States of violating the ceasefire agreement. The White House says the U.S. did not agree that the ceasefire would cover Lebanon. So where is the war heading?
Right. Like you said, Netanyahu has said that Lebanon wasn't involved in the deal. Donald Trump told PBS that. J.D. Vance said it was a miscommunication or misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Iran and Hezbollah they've been very clear that they believe Lebanon is a key part to this whole ceasefire, and that it can't hold if Israel continues to attack Hezbollah in Lebanon. So, they're threatening retaliation. Iran has now close the strait again, which is kind of the whole premise about having the ceasefires to get the strait open. So this could really function as a spoiler. If that's by design or if that's a misunderstanding is a bit unclear, but it's a big hurdle to get over in order for people to sit down and talk in Islamabad.
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned that because both the United States and Iran have said they will begin talks this weekend in Pakistan. How do you see this negotiation playing out?
Well, they're both saying that that the other one has violated the terms of the agreement already. So we may not get there, to be perfectly honest. But even if we do, there are a lot of sticking points. Both sides are kind of showing these maximalist demands that aren't going to go over very well with the other side, I don't think. Iran has a tendency to drag out negotiations and kind of bide for time. Remember, it took 2.5 years for the JCPOA to get negotiated under the Obama administration. And I think that there's a high probability that they'll do the same. Strategically speaking, this time, I think that they'll assume that the likelihood of the U.S. will to re-engage militarily will decrease as time goes on. Donald Trump didn't react to this strategy very well in the last 2 negotiations. So we'll see if there's going to be a different approach, and we'll also see if there's not a different approach if Donald Trump has the will to step back in militarily, if he thinks that it's just another stall tactic. Where does it go from here? And it's the probability of a meaningful, lasting peace seems kind of small right now. They disagree. Both sides disagree on the fundamental terms of the agreement. The U.S. believes that the free flow of ships through the strait is the basis for the deal, and Iran's saying that there needs to be a toll paid, $2 million per ship. So we're 24 hours, not even 24 hours in, and the last I've seen, I think Lebanon, Israel, Iran, Bahrain, Kuwait, UAE, and Saudi Arabia have all been under attack after the ceasefire went into place.
Right.
Not to mention, as of this morning, I think the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia was also hit. That's not going it's underreported anyway, and this is a significant escalation because there's 7 million barrels a day going through that, and that's bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. So if we can't get ships through the strait and oil isn't coming out of Yanbu, depending on what the damage is there, and it can't go out the Bab al-Mandab, then we're taking, that's a total of about 22 million barrels a day, if you take the 15 and the 7. So, it doesn't look good so far, and the rhetoric isn't exactly getting better. We're still in the early hours or days of this going on, but right now I don't necessarily see a positive direction. That could be turned around if both sides kind of step away from maximalist demands, but we'll see if there's a will to do so.
I see. And China and Russia vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for efforts to protect the commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. What role do you think Beijing and Moscow could play in shaping what happens next?
Yeah, I don't think it should come to a surprise to anybody that they did that. They didn't really show up much in the 12-day war for Iran, and Iran was critical of this. And this hasn't been the case this time. In this conflict, Russia and China are not neutral actors. China buys over 90% of Iran's oil, and it's thought that the IRGC controls 50% of Iran's oil exports. The IRGC also imports Chinese methods and technologies of monitoring the public, and China provides the chemical precursors for the solid fuel that is fueling the missiles. Also China and Russia both supply advanced weaponry and technology that improve the drones, the Shahed drones, and they've been providing satellite imagery and targeting intelligence. And this isn't, too dissimilar. I think the U.S. provides targeting intelligence for Ukraine, so it's a bit of a tit for tat. And I don't think it's a big surprise that they weren't going to give diplomatically in the UN. They weren't going to give one of their allies targets, Bahrain, who brought this initiative to the Security Council. They weren't going to give them that diplomatic win in this case. Strategically, I think both of them like watching the U.S. burn through stockpiles of interceptors, and I think that they like having the U.S. military engaged in theaters that aren't near them. So. Their behavior doesn't surprise me at all. I think it's strategic and it makes logical sense. As far as what they can do to help or change the outcome, I think China especially has a great deal of leverage over Iran. So I would argue that it could play a big role in the outcome of the conflict. I think neither of them will have too much leverage over the U.S. though. So they can at least influence part of the equation, and we'll see if they decide to do so or not.
Right, we'll have to see how that goes. All right, Professor Lawrence, thanks so much for taking the time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
Thank you.